Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for attending this both virtual and real live show this morning. It gives me pleasure to introduce Andrew Southey, who's been here in Hermanus a long time. Andrew, I guess in simple terms, is an entrepreneur of note. He's been a very successful businessman in all sorts of businesses. Just by way of background, he was born in the Karoo, Stainsburg, and he ended up training to be a vet. He went to Marlow Agricultural College in the Karoo. And his talents go well beyond that. He's been a successful businessman, as I said, an entrepreneur. He was a very successful veterinary scientist and vet. And he's been a tremendous sportsman. I believe he played cricket and rugby and most other sports for Hermanus or in this area. And he is also a very smart chess player. So we really look forward to Andrew's presentation today. And I think most of all, as we've seen this morning, people have really enjoyed being back in a real life situation here, having a breakfast and interacting with one another. And so we welcome all of you, and we equally welcome the people that are on Zoom. And fantastic, guys, thanks. I see there's about 16 or 20 of you online as well. And hopefully the system works and the sound gets through to you and Henny gets this properly recorded. So thanks, Andrew, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I must say I've been so intimidated by this technology that I think I've forgotten what to say. But let's kick off. You know, I saw Al Gore's presentation way back, and obviously I think one came away from that being very concerned. But anyway, that's a long time ago. Fortunately, many of his predictions haven't come true. The Arctic ice caps are still there, so that's okay. What kind of got me, I've started questioning things, you know, and so you question one thing and then another, and humanity is at war with carbon dioxide. And it bothered me because carbon dioxide feeds the food chain on land and earth. And so life on the planet is so dependent on the supply of carbon dioxide. So it worried me, why are we at odds with carbon dioxide? And also I raise earthworms and do this for farmers on quite a large scale. And so I got quite involved in getting some insight into soil improvement. And one of the things we lack in our soils is organic matter. And our only supply to improve organic matter is from atmospheric carbon dioxide. And so I think actually Henny said to me quite some time ago, we were just talking about it, so he said, why don't you put this together, you know? And so eventually I landed up doing that. And I like things to make sense. So if someone tells me X, I want to know why we end up with Y. And so I started looking at different aspects of carbon dioxide. At one stage, they told us that carbon dioxide is the control knob for the temperature on the planet. So I've plagiarized that, and I've called it CO2, the control knob for life on Earth. And we'll see the CO2 level is almost on empty, and I'll try and clarify that immediately. And if we look at this graph, then we can see that we are really at a low point. And the red line you see at the bottom is the critical line. If we go below 200 parts per million, then life on Earth as we know it will start to fade away. And so obviously, if we look at 300 million years ago, we were very close to that. And I'll clarify what happened there and how it came back again in a little bit further on. And we'll repeat this graph again sometime. Unfortunately, we've been inundated with all sorts of blaring headlines. And it seems to me almost a pastime. It's almost, I think, the default story for the press. When something else is, there isn't much happening in the rest of the world, and they fall back onto this sort of story. And so we'll see all these alarming headings. And I'll just run through them. By the way, if at any point I don't make sense, please stop and say clarify. And we'll do questions. We'll try and get through this in 30 minutes and then allow questions afterwards. But let's just go through this. Rising sea levels, important. Mass extinction. All these various headlines. The science is settled. Well, science is actually never really settled. It's always got to be challenged. And I'm quite happy if you challenge what I have to say, because that's how it works. And we eventually try and get closer to the truth. I took this picture from the brochure, Overstrand brochure. And, you know, it tells a bit of an alarming story. If we look at that picture, and the gist of this brochure is, of course, that we have to reduce our production of carbon dioxide, or else we're going to land up with the Earth looking like it is on the left. And if we take care, it'll be on the right. And then, of course, the hand shows it's in our hands. Well, I'm not sure that we can have too big an influence on that, as we'll see later. So the narratives is CO2 levels are causing temperatures to rise alarmingly, and we're heading for catastrophe, and soon. And it's almost like they've upped the ante, you know, that the message starts getting more and more urgent. So I don't know if they're worried that, you know, that they're losing our attention. We'll go into temperatures a bit later, but clearly they're overstating the temperature rise, in my opinion. To me, we really have a huge disconnect. If carbon dioxide is going to cause the temperature to rise, which I think it will have a modest effect, then they have already reached conclusions without really providing any evidence as to why it will be so detrimental. And then so it's like these wild assumptions. And it's almost sinister, I feel, that we're not interpreting this as to what will happen to biology and how biology works. So there's a huge disconnect. If we have a cause, how do we arrive at the end, or the effect or the consequences? So there's like, it's broader than the Grand Canyon, this huge chasm between what they say will happen, and the consequences. So about the only evidence we have is to look back in history as far as we can. And fortunately, a lot of this has been documented. And so we can, if we go back in history, we can see, but it wasn't so bad, and temperatures were higher. Carbon dioxide was far higher. And that is where we came from, or how biology evolved on the Earth in those circumstances. And a friend of mine, a professor of media studies, said, well, you know, you're out of line. You know, 97% of scientists believe it will cause warming. And kind of, who are you to argue this point? In fact, we don't need to argue the point. I would actually argue further and say, but 100% of us agree that carbon dioxide will create more insulation and retain warmth. So the point is, if I said to someone, you know, if we sleep under 20 blankets, and someone comes and adds a sheet to that, of course there's going to be greater insulation. But what is the consequence? Is it really so much? And of course they're threatening that, you know, by 2050 we could be, you know, 1.5 degrees higher, or by the end of the century, maybe 2 degrees higher. And as one of these leading scientists put it, it's no more than the difference between breakfast and lunch. And I think if we look at how we later on talk about species resilience, but if we look where human beings, before we advanced our civilization in the last century or two, people have been living in the coldest of areas, the Eskimos in snow, the Arabs in the Middle East, in rather extreme conditions. So there's a lot of adaptation and plans made to survive in these, and never mind about species that can adapt. Well, I think Goebbels said in the Second World War, if you tell a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. So if we keep getting bombarded with this, we actually just accept it as being the truth. We stop questioning. And then, of course, you get ridiculed. And so I expect there'll be many people that will tell me many things about what I'm saying, but so be it. I've been kicked off Facebook, by the way. I was called a denier and all sorts of things. And I was just trying to put evidence out there. And I feel ready for scientists because, you know, the whole funding environment has all become so dependent on climate. So if you're going to study the mating habits of a North Sea clam, link it to climate change, and then you'll get funding. If you don't, you will not. And so people are being appointed according to what they say. And so people are scared to come out and ask questions. I think of Professor Judith Curry, who's at the forefront of climate studies. And she was just made to feel so unwelcome in her university that she left. Okay, we need to bear in mind that man has done a lot of damage in different ways to nature. But so we have a guilt, but we mustn't allow that guilt to be misdirected and get coerced into doing things that have nothing to do with it. And I think we have to bear in mind burning fossil fuels has the fallout various other substances which they have to take care of. But carbon dioxide per se is not that. Is not one of those evils. We agree, yes, it will contribute to warming, modest warming. And we have to admit that we have accelerated the rise of carbon dioxide dramatically. I mean, we're looking at 40% in the last 125 years. I mean, that is huge. I think I made a sum somewhere, which, let's just go back to the previous slide. That if we look at the 40% rise, that our temperature has only increased by 0.3%. So sort of doesn't seem to make too much sense. You get such a massive increase, and the consequence has been so little in that same period of time. Okay, Biology 101. And I think we can mainly, if we look at the left-hand side, say that's what nature does, and nature has always been doing. And mainly on the right-hand side, combustion is being essentially mainly done by man. But both of them cycle back and benefit plants. Okay, now we need to look at why carbon dioxide was roughly 17 times greater than it is today. What happened? And what really happened is that fossil fuels started forming. And before that, plants weren't able to grow very big because they hadn't yet produced lignin and hemicellulose, the hard parts, hardwood. And when they started doing this, of course, they flourished and grew bigger and higher and taller. And when they died, this accumulated because there was nothing to break it down. So if we go back to that previous slide, a large plant of the plant material was not going back into the atmosphere. So it became sort of a one-way show. And so our carbon dioxide became depleted, about close to being depleted 300 million years ago. And if I'm talking about depleted, I'm talking about the critical levels. And so also, if we look back at when carbon dioxide was high, from the evidence, it appears that there were no deserts and it was all very much sort of a green planet. But it would appear that this, well, first of all, when we talk about extinctions, we all tend to think about events, not about processes. But no one seems to talk much about the depletion of carbon dioxide contributing to extinctions. I mean, there's so many different reasons for extinctions. So you can imagine with that low carbon dioxide that the plant wealth and animals declined considerably. Then came the reprieve. And that was the advent of white rot fungus, of which is obviously there are many different types now, that were able to break down wood, and that stopped the formation of fossil fuels. Apparently, the wood matter built up to like 100 meters deep, and obviously when eventually it was covered, it became things like coal and oil and whatever. So then when white fungus came about, the wood could be broken down and that carbon dioxide could be released back to the atmosphere. And so our carbon dioxide recovered. But then followed the next assault, which might actually have started, you know, at the same time as the wind, but it became more and more relevant. And that was the blossoming of the crustaceans. So they bind carbon dioxide with calcium, and they form calcium carbonate, which is pretty stable and just stays there. And if we look at the White Cliffs of Dover, that's a very good example of all the shell matter that has accumulated over the millennia. And that's still an ongoing process. And if we look back at that slide, we'll see that carbon dioxide, having recovered, started reducing again. Until we got to about empty again, you know, to the 200 parts per million level. And then inadvertently, we were only energy hungry, but inadvertently we started building up carbon dioxide again, which we've done rather dramatically. And I would agree that it's quite astounding as to how fast we've actually increased the levels of carbon dioxide. I put there no deserts. We now about, if we look at the earth, I mean the land volumes now, we're looking at about 1/3 forests, 1/3 deserts, and 1/3 in between, sort of, okay, in between. Okay, so if we look at what are the consequences if we increase carbon dioxide, and what are the consequences if we decrease carbon dioxide? Now, there have been many, many experiments doing this. And carbon dioxide is used in tunnels to augment carbon dioxide, double it up, and then they get more than 100% increase in their yields within these tunnels. Now, I had that information, and believe it or not, Google suppresses this information now. So that the information I could access 5 years ago, I cannot access today. Their smart bots and whatever algorithms prevent that. Someone showed if you type in climate change on Google, they'll say something like 4.3 billion hits. And when you start going through the options, you only get to about 450. The rest are being archived or whatever, swept under the carpet. So there's a lot of information that I had on hand some time ago, which I cannot access anymore. And if I stored it, I don't know where I stored it. So, okay. So if we look at luckily one of the images I managed to find or keep, and you can see the difference between carbon dioxide at 196 parts per million versus where it's been increased, sort of doubled. And you can see the huge difference in plant growth. And then you can see on the right how, as you increase it, the plant growth improves. Of course, there are many people that attack this. That it seems now to be accepted that carbon dioxide improves plant growth. But then some wise guy, I saw an article, they say, yeah, but this is not healthy. Because if you increase the plant mass, your percentage of minerals will diminish. So, well, there might be some truth in that, but if you're a farmer, you're going to make sure you augment those minerals if it's for food production. The one thing that keeps popping up is polar bears. And we were told that they were under extreme threat because their habitat is melting away. And if we look at the numbers, we see that they're rising quite rapidly. Now, part of that might be due to protection, less hunting, although they're now beginning to hunt them again because they're becoming a nuisance in America, Russia, I think Greenland, some other place as well. So what I found quite interesting is I read a short article the other day about what happens if we have a nuclear war, you know, if the Ukrainian thing blows up into nuclear war. And the thing that struck me was that this would cool the seas because you'd have this massive cloud and the seas couldn't warm. And they said then your absorption of carbon dioxide will diminish because as the sea cools, it won't absorb as much carbon dioxide. Now that's critical because photosynthesis is about 1/3 on land and 2/3 in the sea. So the plankton produces the food, and that's responsible for the whole food chain in the sea. And so it was predictable if carbon dioxide was to rise, that there'd be more food for the polar bears. And the polar bears seem to be very happy if we look at the numbers increasing. Obviously, not the only factor. The relationship between carbon dioxide and water is so important. Photosynthesis, I would say, is supported by 3 main pillars. The one is sun energy, and the other is carbon dioxide, and then the other is the presence of water. And we know how critical the presence of water is to life on Earth. Now, I listened to an article the other day that says since 2000 till now, the Earth has greened 15%. NASA produced figures before that showed that it had increased over a couple of decades by 20% before that. And the increase in greening has taken place mainly in the arid areas. So now if we understand the relationship between carbon dioxide and water, if you're in a rainforest, the water isn't so critical. But if you're in an arid area, it is so important because the plants, to take in carbon dioxide, have to open their stoma or their pores. And it is said that they lose, for every molecule of carbon dioxide that that plant absorbs, it loses 100 molecules of water. So now you can see how critical it is in these arid areas. So I can't give you an exact graph as to how it will improve the utilization of water, but like you could assume that if you double carbon dioxide, you halve the time the stoma have to stay open, and your water can go twice as far in plant growth. And I think this is a point that's not so well understood. So the greening of the planet that's taken place in the last 23 years or 22 years has been mainly in arid areas. And as Professor Jordan Peterson says, that's almost an area greater than the United States. I mean, that is so significant that we are reversing, or deserts are reducing, the size of deserts are reducing, and green is encroaching on it. So this may also help to explain why the planet was much greener way back. So I put this in to kind of emphasize that this is what we see, especially in coastal areas where there are persistent winds from a certain direction. I think you'll see something similar on the cliff paths that the fynbos grows at an angle. And the reason is that wind is rather detrimental to plants, because if they have their pores open, they're going to lose more water. So when there's wind, the pores are triggered to close. But if they close, they can't grow. So as we can see with this tree, it's only been growing on the leeward side of the wind, not on the windward side, which is a good example of what happens if you deprive a plant of carbon dioxide. It simply just cannot grow normally. Probably the best place on Earth for biology would be a rainforest. Ian, would you agree?
I would agree.
Our biology is at its best, and our soil biology is at its best. And that's where we'll find the greatest amount of greenhouse gases. And because it's so protected, the wind doesn't whisk away the carbon dioxide, so the plants are able to recycle it. So if we are able to reproduce those conditions, then we will get the best results with our plant growth. Now, this kale that you see is in my tunnel. So the tunnel, the netting diminishes the amount of wind or breeze that comes through. And we've also put a lot of my earthworm castings into the soil. So we regenerated the soil, and it's working well. And of course, your soil is now like a living being, so it's releasing carbon dioxide as well, and the wind is not taking it away. So we've improved that cycle. Now this kale got up to almost 2 meters high. I mean, it's quite unreal. And so we see if you can improve the conditions for the plants, they will flourish. Temperature. Okay. We are told that the temperature increased by 0.8 of a degree since 1900, more or less, somewhere there. And I think that we have to believe that. The problem with measuring the temperature is, where do you measure it? Because different parts of the globe are changing all the time. And so do you measure it at the top of the ocean, the middle of the ocean, the bottom of the ocean? And so which continent are you going to measure it on? And so they've got all these different measuring stations, and they sort of average it out. And I think we must abide by that. It's this. Carbon dioxide is much easier. They monitor that at Mauna Loa out in the mid-ocean. So they use a single point to monitor that. So that's much easier. But if we look at this chart, and this chart comes up quite a lot, Google hasn't removed it yet. And we can notice the blue line is temperature, and we can notice the black line is carbon dioxide, and we can see they're not joined at the hip. So something else is at play, not just carbon dioxide, most definitely not. The other interesting thing is, if you look at the average global temperature, then we're probably still about 10 degrees below that. So most of our life on Earth has evolved during much higher temperatures and much higher carbon dioxide levels. So it's like, you know, what are you scaring us with? Then, you know, when Al Gore brought out his inconvenient truth, quite a few things happened in that. They kind of got rid of the medieval warming period, and then they squeezed up the graph to make sure that it looked like temperature had really spiked. You know, if you squeeze a graph, then it looks a bit different. But I found this image, and they say that there have been at least 75 major swings in temperature in the last 4,500 years. And it certainly doesn't follow a carbon dioxide graph. Now, this is the last 80 years, and we see actually that it's cooled a bit. But, you know, the biggest problem is one can't just take a snapshot of a particular time and say, okay, that proves this or proves that. So I just put this idea out of interest. It doesn't prove anything, but it's just interesting that there's actually been a slight drop. Climate models, I think the most consistent thing about climate models is they failed us. You know, all the predictions, the polar caps would disappear and this would happen and that would happen. And it's not to do really with the climate models. They've actually got an impossible mission. As this one professor explained, that if we want to determine what happens 100 meters down in a stream to the eddies, how they will behave, even that is mission impossible for a model to predict precisely what's going to happen to those water eddies. Now that's quite simple compared to climate, which is so huge and so many variables. And so what you're going to get out of your climate models is really what you put in. And I'm not saying they aren't useful, but I think one has to be very cautious of the predictions, because the predictions are going to predict almost what you want them to predict. Professor William Happer says, well, if we double carbon dioxide, it's calculable as to what it will do to the temperature. And he says it will be less than 1 degree. And he says that's rather disappointing to the activists. So it kind of bursts the bubble a bit. And Professor Happer is an absolute expert on, he's a physicist and an absolute expert on carbon dioxide. It's been his life mission. Then, you know, we always remember the concept of a greenhouse very positively, because that's a place where you keep your plants and they would grow and they would flourish. And now suddenly greenhouse gas has become a swear word. And I mean, really, if we go back to the tropical rainforest, that's where our greenhouse gases are maximized, and that is a greenhouse. I mean, how can it be bad? So, and if we are augmenting that greenhouse, can that be bad? Then the real threat to us is cold, because, you know, we romanticize the ice sheets for various reasons. But if you go and look beneath the ice sheets, they've covered forests, they've annihilated nature. And there was a sudden cold snap apparently in Europe, and 500,000 people died. This was about 1100 years ago. And it was caused by the melting of the ice sheet in Greenland, which then the meltwater then cooled the currents, and Europe didn't warm. And that created mayhem. I mean, crop production, everything diminished. And so I think we need to worry a lot more about cold than warming. I listened to a video recently by a fellow who's an expert on the Milankovitch cycles. And he's adamant this is the main driving force of temperature on Earth. I can't say that I fully understand it, but you can see it's composed of 3 different cycles that change at different times. And he said that according to him, we should be cooling right now. But he believed that carbon dioxide was delaying that cooling. Whether he's right or wrong, I cannot say. Then just out of interest, you know, we kind of think of, like, when you put sugar in your tea or coffee and you stir it, it's spread evenly. And we kind of think that when they mention the carbon dioxide concentration of the globe, that it's absolutely evenly spread, but that's not so. If we look at this, it's just a snapshot of a video of these clouds of carbon dioxide moving. So in the Northern Hemisphere winter, it'll become very red. And then depending on wind currents, it'll move around until it mixes. And what was quite interesting in 2012 here, the farmer where I get manure from for my earthworms, they had wheat production coming out of their ears. The name is Ampi Ambleton. You'll know Ampi, yeah? So I said to Ampi, but what was different? He says, nothing. The rain was not the same, and their crops were suddenly, I mean, hugely increased. I remember riding to Refuge on the end many months after harvesting, and these bales, these big round bales, were still lying on the land. The farmers didn't know what to do with them. Do you remember that, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. And about the only thing I can think of, because if you look at the movement of carbon dioxide, that something may have changed with the winds or something, and we got the benefit of maybe the carbon dioxide from the peninsula. I don't know. But it was interesting that there wasn't actually an identified reason. Just by the way, talking of farming, they monitor all sorts of things, temperature, rainfall, but no one monitors carbon dioxide. It's such an important input into agricultural production that you think it would be that they would be monitoring it and seeing how's it going. What was different this season from last season? I think we've basically covered what's on this screen. It's quite interesting, you know. I think that one kind of gets the impression that, okay, we suddenly arrived on the planet and all these species were put there, and now we've had extinctions. And extinctions have been obviously quite a problem. Some of them, well, they were natural extinctions, and others where our ancestry decided to shoot out the dodos and whatever. So, and we may have contributed to extinctions. But what's so important is speciation. And we know that the planet started with microbes that then evolved, and then we got more complicated creatures, and so it built up. So here's this graph shows the speciation. I don't know why there was such a dip nearly 500 million years ago, but whatever the factors were. But if we follow that graph, it sort of follows that graph I showed you on carbon dioxide. I think it's the next slide. Quite a similar pattern. So it kind of says, well, when carbon dioxide is high, then it aids speciation and obviously aids nature, excepting when it's a new virus, what we don't like. Now, there are different takes on this graph. I just put it in to show that we're emitting so much, plants are emitting so much, plants absorbing, and so forth. What's quite interesting, I said do the sums, and I'm not going to repeat it here because it depends. You're going to make an assumption. Okay, if you want to improve the amount of organic matter in your topsoil, you have to make an assumption of how deep. Are you going to go 30 centimeters, 10 centimeters, how much? Then you're going to need so much organic matter to come in, and therefore you need so much carbon dioxide. But the bottom line is I sort of worked out on one of my sums that if we continue producing or overproducing carbon dioxide as we are, it will take us about 240 years to be able to get all the soils on the planet back to a reasonable level again. That's including the deserts. This is quite an astounding graph. You know, we keep getting told that sea level moved by 1 centimeter or half a centimeter or something like that. But we're emerging from a mini ice age. And only 20,000 years ago, we were in this mini ice age. Look at what's happened to the sea level. It's up by 140 meters. That is huge. So you can imagine the amount of human and animal displacement there was as the sea level came up. I mean, I think there's cities beneath the sea. But it is quite astounding. And in fact, if you look at how it's tapered off at the top there, we're actually in quite a stable time at the moment. But I find that, so we could have actually walked across quite happily to Gansbaai, the danger point now, because the sea would have been way out there. That's 20,000 years ago. This is I should have put the name in, a tardigrade. And this is probably the most resilient animal on the planet. And they're different species, and they're tiny little things. You've got to look at them under the microscope. And I think they've actually survived for hundreds of millions of years. But I just put it there because obviously there are some species that are more fragile and change can wipe them out. But generally, we have a lot of tolerance. And as I mentioned, people living in different parts of the globe, especially the warmer areas. Okay, this doesn't apply to everyone. Solzhenitsyn wrote this when he was a victim of the Soviet Union. And I think they locked him up in Siberia somewhere. And that the intransigence of the powers that be. And I think we have a lot of this involved in what is going on at the moment. There are many people who obviously genuinely believe that we, are on the brink of extinction and that. And those are the activists who don't necessarily do their research. But I think if you read that, it's quite self-explanatory. Okay, we're getting towards, well, we are now at the end. And it was interesting in that brochure, it said we'd been through this drought a few years ago, and it was a terrible drought. And this hadn't happened since 1904. And therefore, by implication, it means it's as a result of human climate change, human-induced anthropogenic. But this theme is repeated over and over on the news channels without the person thinking, but what caused it in 1904? And like we have a massive flood and a meteorologist gets up on TV to tell us about the weather. And he says, a flood like this hasn't happened for 125 years. This is absolute evidence of climate change. Without asking himself, but what caused it back then? We certainly weren't burning fossil fuels at the rate we are now. So I am of the firm opinion that as carbon dioxide rises, that we will shift more to the green. And if we diminish carbon dioxide, we'll move more to the left. Exactly the opposite as to what the brochure is trying to tell us. And then the hand, I'm not sure that we have much influence on this. Obviously, we have an influence on the amount of carbon dioxide we emit. But no one has yet found a good alternative source of energy other than nuclear. And of course, nuclear has its problems or its concerns. So I think with all the noise going around that we'll be using fossil fuels for quite some time to come. That's it.
Thanks, Andrew. That was fantastic. Judy, are you going to manage questions from your group?
Yes, apart from the first, from the space is brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. Questions?
I want to ask, will this be available for distribution or private use?
We'll have to ask the boss.
No, all our stuff goes automatically onto a YouTube website. So this presentation from Zoom will be uploaded to YouTube, and we'll send you the link. We've got 120 odd presentations already on that YouTube link. You've got to check it out before it gets taken off.
Yes.
I'd like to have it. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Questions, John?
Andrew, yeah, that is great. But I just have a couple of comments about your relationship between vegetation growth and carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
There were no great forests 550 million years ago, but there was a massive explosion of life when carbon dioxide was maximum in the Cambrian from that graph we had.
Yeah.
So there's that linkage, and they were all in the oceans. Vegetation, as we know it, like forests and things, only started to develop towards the end of the Devonian. It was in the Carboniferous, for obvious reasons it's called Carboniferous.
Yeah.
When the coal measures throughout the world, the major coal measures were laid down. So that was the death of all of that vegetation and the sudden drop in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere because it was all in the ground.
Yeah.
So now we're exhuming. But other than that, there were those developments of life which also related to ice ages. Throughout Earth's history, there's been a sudden explosion of change of increase in life. And usually mostly it was in the oceans initially, immediately after a major ice age, even down to the extent of the minor ice age which we find in the Table Mountain group. Immediately after that, you started to see trilobites and people forming in sediments. But that was very primitive. And that seems to be like a steps up each time. And yeah, that's as I understand.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, I can only, one thing I said is, please don't take my word for it. Ask the questions, and unfortunately, I wasn't here 500 million years ago. So, but obviously, the hard matter must have started happening, I imagine, in the Carboniferous period.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
That's why it's called.
Yeah.
But I mean, the depictions of what the environment was, where all these sandstones laid down in the Table Mountain group, was an icy windswept desert.
Yeah.
Equivalent to Iceland, but it was eroding only granites and older sandstones in cratonic areas. There was nothing holding it down because there's so much clean sand coming into the ocean.
And maybe just to follow up and put all this in perspective, what we need to do, John and Andrew and Henny, is have another trip to the Calders, where there's been some remarkable work done by Zico Museum. And when you start looking back at this, I mean, you talked about walking across the bay. Well, that actually happened. Back here, sort of in this middle Iron Age, and Mike can probably add to this, sea level here was way down. The people, our early ancestors who lived in those caves, would have been walking 5 or 6 kilometers to get down to the shoreline.
Yeah.
And people like Hayley Cawthra, who have talked to us in the past couple of years, she's actively studying that stuff, that real climate change. And she, for example, has died on the Augullis Bank, which is just a drowned beach now. And we all forget here, where we're standing today, we're on a 35-meter beach 3.2 million years ago. So if you've been standing here and you can see it all the way around, you know, this overstrand area, you know, you've got your feet wet. And this, you know, this period of change has been phenomenal, and it's beautifully preserved. You know, Mike has been part of a field trip to the Calderns, and so, you know, we'll do it again, because there you can see both archaeological stuff, and then there are also these beautiful megadunes about 2 million years, which John Milan is an expert. So, you know, watch the space. We're going to do that again as well.
Okay, any questions from the guys on Zoom? You can feel free to text or just unmute yourself and ask the question of Dr. Southey, Anthony Keane, Bruce, Adrian. Anyone of you got questions for Andrew?
And 2 questions from the floor. Yeah.
And there's a, sorry, Andre?
Andre, increases CO2, then the sea level rises. If we say, like Bangladesh or wherever.
How much you reckon it will rise?
I think if there's any threat posed, if carbon dioxide is going to push the temperature up, that is the biggest threat to the guys that are on the, especially small islands that are very low. But I don't think that carbon dioxide is going to play so much of a role on sea level rise compared to, say, the Milankovitch cycle.
But Andre, I mean, you're a marine geologist expert. I mean, you know that the sea level's gone up and down, and I mean, unfortunately, and that's what we're talking about. You know, there's just too many people on this globe. So, and it's not politically correct. But if we look around the place in Bangladesh and, you know, all of those areas is a classic example of what does happen to those people. And politically, you know, it's a great one to say, well, look at what you're doing to the globe. But unfortunately, you know, how do we address the population explosion? And until we, you know, get our minds around that, then I think people like Gore and all these people who I think are really sadly out of touch and misleading the world population are going to have a field day. And if you think of the money spent on all of those amazing COPE conferences, etc., I mean, imagine if that money had been put into education and upliftment of disadvantaged people.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions here. Can I just ask you to speak up loudly so that the people on Zoom can hear your question as well?
Let's start with Mike here quickly.
Mike Dormer.
Is there a hard and fast correlation between the rate of carbon dioxide increase in the atmosphere and the transgression and regression rates of the sea level?
So
we're saying that carbon dioxide there's plenty of carbon dioxide in the air, we're going to now get warmer, so the glaciers are going to melt, and that progression or transgression will happen during that period. Can we actually say that carbon dioxide has a direct influence on the rate of transgression or regression?
Well, I've tried to point out that it's a minor play, in my opinion. Maybe even possibly insignificant, but that's pushing it maybe. So just in relation to what John was saying, you know, we have to decide, are we wearing a human hat or a nature hat? And so if we get displacement of people, that can be very sad. But nature as a whole may benefit on the other side. So, but I think the sea is going to almost do what it wants to do without our help.
Just to add to that, Mike, one of the real problems, challenges, and you'll understand it from making ice. If you melt something, you know, things melt quickly. But to create ice and icebergs and you know, these huge landscapes of frozen material, it takes a tremendous amount of effort and cooling. So, you know, you mount things at the sea level, it goes up quite quickly. And look at the sea level curves. You know, we've got all those molecular cycles of information from Haley. You know, it's an asymmetric type graph.
And exactly following that means that, you know, all of this lockup of carbon is happening slowly as compared to melting of ice and what have you. So those rates to me are completely out of sync. We have Milankovitch cycles, which are hard and fast physical events. All right, hard and fast is a little tight, but they are physical events which you can actually measure. And you can recognize that graphically. There's a definite cyclicity to it. But this relationship that people are trying to point out is saying carbon goes up, so everybody's going to drown. It's not there.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, then there's the time factor.
Yeah.
So on that,
sorry,
Chris.
Andrew talked a lot about carbon dioxide as a driver of biological processes.
A driver of?
Sure. Carbon dioxide is driving biological processes.
Yeah.
Which is responding to the carbon currents in the atmosphere. What is the driver of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere?
What is the driver of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the question from the audience.
We talked about carbon dioxide as being a driver of biology. What is the driver of the carbon dioxide?
Well,
do you have any thoughts on James Lovelock's hypothesis that the biology actually drives the atmospheric chemical quantity?
Well, certainly carbon dioxide is a result of biology releasing it, as we've seen from that cycle. At the moment, because we're now unleashing fossil fuel side, carbon dioxide from fossil fuels, we are driving it considerably. But I don't know what else. I mean, obviously volcanoes and that release carbon dioxide. And so I think, obviously, if we look at that other graph, kind of try to show how much is coming from being released from the sea and how much is being absorbed from the sea and how much is being released from plants and how much is being absorbed from plants. So I don't know.
Plants there were 16 as against 29 with plants.
Yeah. So there are different things that I think that someone argued about the last 800,000 years of temperature and carbon dioxide. And I think it was Patrick Moore that said, but the carbon dioxide followed the temperature. So in other words, if it warmed, your biology was more active and therefore more carbon dioxide. Now that's, I can't say who's right or who's wrong about that. But to me, you know, we didn't mention methane. And methane is the most powerful greenhouse gas, but it's measured in parts per billion, and it is unstable. So it breaks down within 10 years of it being released. But, you know, it's like our wetlands release almost a quarter of the atmospheric methane. So what I'm trying to say is methane is actually almost an indicator of successful biology. And I saw an article where it was measured 10,000 times greater in the water on the floor of a forest versus the atmosphere. And then you also have methanophores that feed on it. So, but to me, if methane particularly, I see as an indicator of successful biology. Obviously, a lot of us is trapped under ice sheets, and they all worry that, you know, when the ice sheets melt, it's going to be released. But I don't see that as a crisis.
John.
Just to add to the question about sea level rise, Haley Forthman's work around the coast here, she predicts 11 meters of sea level rise in the next 40,000 years, which looks like geological scale.
Yeah.
And this is what we've seen, it dropped from the last bench here 3.5 million years ago, down to 140 meters below sea level. And that was
still less dramatic than that graph.
yeah, that's right.
What does he ascribe it to?
No, that's coming out of the last ice age. That's coming out of the last. The other thing about ice that always struck me is that in ice freezer, ice blocks in an ice tray, if you leave them there away from your holiday house for 3 or 4 months and you come back, there's less ice in the ice tray. Ice is one of those things that sublimates, goes from solid to gas without a liquid form. So what happens in Antarctica?
I can't answer the question.
We haven't got that change.
So I just think it's worth also reminding ourselves that we've been warming since I think the middle of the 19th century, around the 1850 mark, long before carbon dioxide emissions could have possibly had any effect on the increase in temperature. All they do is take a short-term correlation and extrapolate it 500 million years.
Well, we saw the graph of the 75 swings in 4,500 years. I mean, we have nothing or little to do with it.
But I think Ian's point is quite critical as well, and you also made the point, Mike. I mean, there's this, volcanic activity. So we're blaming everything, on humans. Mike, if you look at the volcanic events, if you look at Tonga recently, Mount St. Helens, just in our lifetime, that you can think of, Krakatoa just before us. Those events, and there'll be lots of ice and everywhere else, also produce an enormous amount of methane and CO2 and gas. So, how do you separate it in these measurements? And that's exactly what Ian's saying. I mean, we try to rationalize everything in a paper, in a piece of paper. You turn that piece of paper on its side, that's, even that shows too much time compared to how long we've been on this globe. And if we think back to, for example, the dinosaur extinction 65 or 66 million years ago, which is supposedly, quite well linked to the Deccan traps and that huge outpouring of basaltic lava, which was very quick. It's like the Karoo. We sort of find more and more, if you date them reliably, the Karoo volcanics in this country and the Lubombo have been perhaps 1 million years. So a huge, massive outpouring of lava and gas, and the Deccan was responsible for killing the dinosaurs. So time, aspects are also critical, and how do we rationalize this little piece of paper in terms of all that's happening?
I don't know how many people have perhaps been to Antarctica, one of those, or the Arctic, but it was quite interesting going there, and we spent a lot of time on the rubber ducks. And they used to send us out from the boat, there were only 20 of us, and they'd say, bring back black ice. Now, the black ice is glacial ice. And the reason it's black, of course, it's been compressed over probably millions of years. And the fun was to bring back black ice, because it was quite sometimes difficult to see the water, but you'd find this absolutely clear, because now ice is very clear. Bring it back and they put it in a public mouth, and you just got to chip it. You could throw it into a drink, and it used to be like a fuzz the way it expanded. It was quite interesting. That amount of compression can be invasive. So they take up a lot less space than most of the other ices.
Okay. Any last great thoughts? Comments?
Do you have any message?
No, there's been no people here are quite happy with what you've said.
Okay.
In short, it's impossible that we'll destroy this earth.
Well, I think, Martin, I mean, we do some damage, obviously. Just look at our environment, the invasives, the shortage of water and the onerous history.
Plastics.
Pollution, those, quite frankly, are the things we should be worried about. We fish the coastline dry. We go into our doctor's rooms, and John will agree they've just upgraded their rooms and have these wonderful historical pictures. I mean, the fish they used to pull up the old harbour, you needed a couple of people to take them out the boat.
So do we carry on with doing our fossil fuel exploration?
Yes, because it's clean.
Do we all agree?
Yeah, and you know, it would be a game changer for the country. So yeah, we definitely need to keep up. And unfortunately, I think he's a clown, but I agree with Mantash. You can't just turn off coal overnight. You know, we're a third world country. We still have millions of people in this country who go and burn powder. You know, and we've got to look at it as, you know, we're not a first world country, unfortunately. We need to think about these other people. So, you know, there's a great deal more to it. There'll be a talk later in the year by Alspermulen on the whales, which we all get, not we, but people get hysterical about. The animals. You know, first of all, they don't do seismic scan when it's whale season. And those animals, if they hear noise, be it penguins or birds or whales, they get out the way when things are happening. And if you look at the money and the quality of those surveys, and we'll get John Milan to give another talk too, you know, all of those sort of things, all this negative activity and stopping, you've seen what's happened in Namibia, they've got world-class gas deposits that they've done. Those deposits don't stop at a political boundary, they come across into Southern African water. Again, for the Northern Cape and Western Cape, that would be a game changer. All the activity and negativity about it is being driven by overseas money, greedy, big money. And to me, you know, that's a real problem. And those are the things we as responsible citizens should be, you know, considering. And yes, we should clean up the plastic and all these things we can make an impact on. But the other things, you know, I think we're very misguided in our attitude.
Thank you very much for attending. We say thank you to Andrew for coming to talk here. And I can ask you to leave your tags at the door. Don't do a Larry Collins and us. Take it home.
And thanks at the back, Annabelle. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eddie.
Thank you, everybody. See you next time.